the entire period counts. As you know, there was only one translation of Труды Свистунова published earlier, and there was some kind of underground translation of Козлиная песня. Now we have it all legit, we have it all in real books and in the wonderful book series NYRB Classics. And we have the panel of participants that includes Edwin Frank, editorial director of NYRB and founder of NYRB Classics, translators of both books, Ainsley Morse of the first book and Geoff of the second book, and they both collaborated on either volume. We have authors of introductions to each volume, Evgeny Ostashevsky and Polina Barskova. And if you are curious about details of their biography, you may look at the back page of the program that I'm holding in my hands, and you may pick up anywhere. So to open this fantastic conversation, I would like to ask Edwin to introduce this volume and this entire project, which is not so frequent to have two volumes of Soviet writer, let's be honest, right? Who died peacefully in his bed, not peacefully, okay, who died in his bed, to be published, and especially in today's political climates. I think that's a huge enterprise and huge step, and I wish Edwin will tell us more about this project. But colleagues, please speak into the microphone, because outside this huge audience, we have huge English audience online. So I don't know how many, but somebody is watching us.
All right. Yes, I'm sure somebody's watching us. Thanks, Mark, and thank you all for coming, and so on. That's a grim thought, that the only reason Soviet writers have been published is if they were killed by the state, even though this writer died as young as any other Soviet writer, and so in some sense has been, well, has also not been paid much attention to. We publish a fair line of Soviet writers, and I guess, I mean, actually the ones that come to mind right off are Platonov and Grossman, but Olesha and probably some others whose names are escaping me now, since we have, in the 25 years we've been around. Krzyzanowski, thank you, also a more or less unknown writer who didn't actually die in a... Yeah, Tefi, not Soviet, right. But anyway, Russian writing has been central to the series and central to my life as a reader, and so it was exciting to hear about Vaginov, which I probably first did maybe more than 10 years ago, I'm sure, from actually Matvey Yankelevich. And, you know, if you're in the business of publishing, which is sort of a kind of Vaginovian business of publishing dead and neglected writers, and in fact, you know, what novelist do you pick up where you find a mention of Aldous Manutius in Venice as a kind of fundamental reference in terms of publishing the classical authors and so on? And here it is in Vaginov, and that is the beginning of the kind of thing that I do. I am a late replicant of the Aldine Press, so you know, you depend on, in effect, psychopomps to lead you down into the land of the dead and to introduce you to the ghosts. And Matvey, the initial introduction was through Matvey, probably seconded by Eugene, I think, and then Ainsley. You know, the name had been put in the back of my head. It buzzed around like a bee. The name is, of course, slightly problematic, and I think for a long time I kind of hesitated about what I thought was a kind of avant-garde writer whose name was the equivalent of penis head or something like that. And it seemed to me that this was a kind of avant-gardism that, was perhaps dated or all too timely. It's a little hard to say. And that's where Ainsley really came in. Ainsley had sat down and had translated the work and worked on the work and is a constant, is communicating about all sorts of interesting things in not only Russian but Serbian and so on. And at some point, I was willing to take the plunge. I don't know that there's that much to be said after that from my angle. I mean, it fits in with the larger project of the publishing program. It fits in almost poignantly, reading Goat Song, in that, if Goat Song is sort of looking at a kind of Soviet erasure of memory, you have to say that capitalism may be doing it a little bit better. In terms of just the disappearance of the classical tradition, the whole series of reference and so on. I mean, the mournful young men and some women of this book would be no less mournful today, I think. Yeah, well, that said, and so in that way, it as I said, it fits in with the sort of overall program. It fits in with our interest in Soviet literature and with Russian literature, and with the ways in which Soviet literature should not be limited to simply dissident literature as opposed to conformist or socialist realist literature. And then finally, one thing, if you depend on psychopomps, is that you especially to take you into languages you don't know at all, is that finally, when the day is done, you read the book that you have never been able to read. And this book has been beautifully translated and is a wonderful book to read now. And I'm very, very happy to be, it's not quite published, but to be about to publish it.
Thank you. All right, thank you so much. Now I want to give the floor to Eugene Ostashevsky as the author of the introduction of the first.
Thanks. What do I want to say? Well, I want to say that I want to talk about how like this. Okay. All right. Вот так. All right. So, I was first introduced to Vaginov by Skidan and Galunka in '95 when I came to Petersburg and met Skidan and Galinka, I think fairly accidentally through friends of friends. My first conversation with Galinka was actually about Nicholas of Cusa. It was in the smoking room of the library. And I was like, wow, this is somebody I could talk to.
Nicholas of Cusa.
Yeah. And then, but, this was a period when, this was a very Vaginov-like period, right? I mean, it was basically like living the Goat Song. Which is kind of like living La Vida Loca, but living the Goat Song, yeah. Because everything was in ruins, nothing worked. There were bandits everywhere. And here was this, group of young people, and all they talked about was, Kuzmin and Vaginov and Harms and Budensky. And I think there actually is something of a kind of a literary universal, like end of empire literature, because the universal of the end of empire is the flea market, right? I mean, this is very much what Vaginov is about. You know, now I live in Berlin, and again I experienced that, right? The flea markets got more expensive, they got worse, they were much better 10 years ago. If you go to the flea market and you find all of these amazing things, not, you know, 16th century first editions for free, but you know, I mean, what have I bought this year? And I practically never go. I just kind of stopped by for 2 minutes. But I bought, I don't know, somebody's, you know, those notebooks, like album with those notebooks that they used to have around 1910, where, you know, people from, young women from middle class families, like copied poems, like, so I got one of those. I got, in the 20s in Germany, you collected stickers that came in cigarette packs. And for example, this tango dancer that I kind of work on, Elsa Kruger, who was Moscow's Queen of Tango in 1915, moved to Germany, became a dancer, then became a movie star, and in 1926, 1927, got her own brand of cigarettes, Elsa Kruger cigarettes. And each pack had a photograph of Elsa Kruger in like a different outfit. And you know, you collect it. Yeah, it was like the original collect them all. So, you know, last time I was at the market, I bought, you know, The World in Pictures, which is actually pictures of cigarette. And when you, I mean, when you buy any kind of used object, right, the object comes with a life of its own, right? And especially when you buy an object that comes in a kind of historical context that is long gone. So the object of, you know, Vaginov writes about this very clearly, is, it's just a double voiced word in Bakhtin, and Vaginov was the court poet of the Bakhtin circle in 1925, 1926. It's true, he was their court poet. You know, and a lot of the stuff that Bakhtin later published was already in discussion. Possibly already the idea of the double-voiced word, possibly, but it appears in 1929, so it appears after Goat's Song in print. But this is what flea market objects are, right? They're things taken out of one context. They retain the traces of that context. If you look at them really closely, you can figure this out. But as flea market items, as things to be sold, as things to be collected, they acquire completely different context. And Vaginov's heroes, I'm going to shut up in a second. Vaginov's heroes are also like these things at the flea market, right? And if you read the Goat Song, it's like a double-voiced word that goes from one meaning, you know, to another meaning, from the pre-Soviet meaning to the Soviet meaning, if it makes it that far, right? So, you know, Vaginov made it that far, but not for long, right? And this is what I'm going to say instead of a biography, which I think is what I promised. But I think everybody here knows.
Maybe not everybody. I knows. We'll check. It's at the end of this panel.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
And now I'm giving the floor to another psychopomp, the professional psychopomp, I would say,
Polina Barskova.
It's also remarkable that you prepared a little paper.
I didn't prepare a little bit. Says it will be different.
I know.
Can we read?
No, this is the introduction.
So since my task is to write the introduction to the second volume, to sum up everything that Zhenya doesn't say, I've been thinking, what is it? Well, first of all, this fall has been for me this extremely peculiar season when I was trying to figure out what does it mean that we're entertaining some form of Vaginov moment, signified by this book, by this translation, but also, I guess, by a larger situation. And our being together in this room obviously is a symptom of that. So I've been looking back at my own story. 25 years ago, I wrote a dissertation with him as a protagonist. And every time I would come to the office of my dissertation advisor, he would look at me with, I think, profound fatigue and ask, well, just tell me that he's not real. He cannot be real. He's an imaginary figure. And somehow it's a very important part of my understanding of Vaginov, but not only of mine. Preparing for the graduate seminar dedicated to the Goat song that I just taught at Berkeley, I read this rather rich corpus of memoirs about him, where usually he is depicted as a very shy and endlessly cute creature, some sort of a well-meaning gnome. And when you read these memoirs and descriptions, feel of, kind of slightly squeamish compassion. And then you read his prose, where he is absolutely merciless. I think one of the nastiest authors of our tradition. One just thinks with joy how you can deceive everybody around you and write all this down. And speaking, I really appreciate Zhenya speaking about flea markets. One of Vaginov's qualities is his incessant curiosity and ability to build himself into, as I understand, every literary milieu of his city of the moment, building these strange figures of approachement, becoming friendly with all these absolutely dissimilar figures of the absurdly rich, like almost nauseatingly rich literary scene of the moment. And then, yes, as we know from the Svistonov book, carefully transferring them on the page. And maybe the last thing about his biography that I've been thinking a lot, and what is the moment of our relationship with Vaginov today? At some point, I caught myself this seminar, this semester, how many times I repeated that Konstantin Vaginov was very lucky to die in 1934. And you know, when you repeat this like 11 times, you think there is something really wrong with this sentence. But indeed, we are dealing, and several of people who are sitting in front of me at the moment are the most interesting dealers with this question. What if he wouldn't died in the year 1934? How different our conversation would be. And what kind of prose would we be discussing here today? So I think these are some of the questions of Vaginov as a popular, translated, and still variously misinterpreted writer whom we're discussing.
Thank you, Polina. Thanks so much. So I think that Vaginov has been properly introduced now, and we can move to the main dish of this presentation, to the readings, and we have 3 translators here, more than 2, and we'll have prose and fiction, and I'm giving the mic to Ainsley.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Mark, for hosting us. Thank you, Edwin, for publishing. So as has already been made clear, this is all we have so far, and we only have about 6 of them. But the book will be out in April. So, and you can order it already. No? You can order it already. So, so this will be now a kind of teaser for all of you who are eager to read and possibly, hopefully, teach Vaginov in English. We just chose a few passages. We're going to take, Geoff and I are going to take turns reading, and Eugene helped us with the translations of poems. So the first of the 2 novels in this first book, Goat Song, has a lot of Vaginov's own poems in it. And Zhenya is kind of working on them in parallel. And have you published some of your translate? Not yet. Okay. And I did just want to say, especially, I know that most of you here are devoted fans already, but for those of you who don't know, this first book will have 2 novels, Goat Song, and we've translated the title of the second novel as The Works and Days of Whistlin'. And if you're curious, as probably many of you are, about some of the translation decisions, you should stick around for the 3rd panel, tomorrow's gathering, because we will be talking about that. Okay, so shall we begin?
Sorry. Okay. I think this is okay. I think we're okay. Yeah. All right. So all of the readings that we'll be doing will be from Goat Song, and we'll give context as necessary, but none needed here because we're starting from the beginning. Forward, spoken by the author who appears periodically at the book's threshold. Petersburg, for me, has been tinted for some time now with a greenish hue, shimmering and flickering, a terrible phosphorescent color. Houses and faces and souls quiver with a greenish flame, snickering and malignant. The flame flickers, and where Pyotr Petrovich stood, you now see instead a slimy, creeping thing. The flame flares, and you see yourself, and you yourself are worse than any vermin. And it's not people walking the streets. Peek under a hat, and you'll spy the head of a snake. Look closely at an old lady, and it's a toad sitting there wiggling its belly. And all the young people each cherish a special dream. The engineer desperately wants to hear Hawaiian music. The student wishes to hang himself with real flair. The schoolboy wants to father a child to prove his virility. Go into a shop, and there's a former general sitting behind the counter, smiling mechanically. Enter a museum, and the guide knows that he's lying, and he goes on lying. I have no love for Petersburg. My dream has ended.
Forward, spoken by the author who made an appearance in the middle of the book. Now there is no Petersburg. There is Leningrad. But Leningrad has nothing to do with us. The author is a coffin maker by trade, not a cradle expert. If you show him a coffin, he'll knock on it right away and find out what it's made of, how long ago, by what tradesman. He'll even call to mind the parents of the deceased. And right now, the author is preparing a coffin for the 27 years of his life. He's terribly busy. But don't go thinking that he's putting together this coffin with any sort of goal in mind. It's just a hobby of his. He takes a sniff, smells like corpses, so we'll need a coffin. And he loves his stiffs and follows them around while they're still alive and shakes their hands warmly and starts conversations with them. And all the while, he's sanding down the boards, stocking up on nails, buying some lace when he can find it.
Now we're dipping back in time to when there was a Petersburg. In those days, 25th October Avenue bore a different name. Adorned with round, blindingly bright electric street lamps, while the surrounding streets and side streets glimmered with gas lighting, the avenue spread out its palaces, churches, and government offices among the residential buildings. Through the glass of windows and doors, one could see snow-white staircases with carpets of the softest hues. Drapes fluttering their silks, little tables made of every possible material, armchairs and sofas of every possible form. Sometimes in long halls beneath ceilings festooned with flying cupids, young people sat the whole night through, gazing into space with dead eyes. Sergei K. sat in his room, which had been divided in two by bookcases holding French books. The dining room, which preserved traces of the 18th century, was quiet. Everyone in the family, even his grandmother, had had their fill of evening tea and dispersed to their separate rooms. His grandmother must be taking off her headdress in front of the mirror, or perhaps spreading some kind of paste on her hands for the night, or freeing herself from her corset with the help of her maid. His mother must be writing to her friend in Paris, or perhaps leafing through her album from before she was wed, or letting down her hair in front of the mirror dressing table, while her maid was letting down the shades. His father, at that moment, was driving up to the yacht club on Morskaya to spend the night at a green table, or perhaps walking into Kuba's restaurant to meet with one of the midnight divas. The clock in the dining room struck 11, the doorbell rang, the unknown poet entered, and the friends went out. The moon and the stars came into focus above the city. Snow squeaked underfoot, trams, white with light and stuffed with Zem City officials, tooted away. Cinemas offered alluring spectacles, and individuals lurking under gates offered pornographic booklets and cards. Couples trotted along in cabs and taxis rolled past, ready to race off. On the sidewalks, in clumps, women with painted faces stood, strolled, and pawed the ground. The unknown poet stopped. Remember last night? He turned his face with its overhanging brow and atrophied lower half towards Sergei K. When the Neva turned into the Tiber and we wandered around Nehru's gardens. The Esquiline cemetery surrounded by the dull eyes of Priapus. I saw the new Christians. Who will they be? I saw the acolytes, the dispensers of bread. I saw indistinct crowds demolishing idols. What do you think it means? What does it mean? The unknown poet gazed into the distance. In the sky before him, he saw it gradually taking shape. The terrifying, boarded-up, empty city, overgrown with grass. The two friends were walking along the well-lit, buzzing, chattering, singing, shouting, jingling, gleaming, frolicking street among the utterly unsuspecting crowds.
In this next excerpt, you meet, well, I guess we've met the unknown poet. You meet another major character of the book, who most of you will know as Chipcholkin, but we introduce him in English. He is now called Baumkafkin. Baumkafkin glanced out the window to see whether the unknown poet was coming and saw that indeed he was, tapping his walking stick, waving his hat, and carrying a new manuscript. I will now make merry in an unknown land, thought Baumkafkin, and ran to open the door. They kissed in greeting, cursed the modern age, spat with feeling at a group of young pioneers passing by. What a generation this is, lacking all humanist sentiment, soon to be genuine representatives of the Middle Ages, fanatics, barbarians, unenlightened by the light of the Studia Humanitatis. Yes, nastiness and beastliness all around, barbarization, nodded Baumkafkin. They sat. And there has always been nastiness and beastliness all around, loathsome tramping, Baumkafkin continued after some thought. I'm imagining how those white guard types must wreak havoc in their consulates abroad. Before the new ambassador can move in, they tear down the wallpaper, spit all over the ceiling, and rip up the parquet. They don't sit down by the fireplace to enjoy one last moment of melancholy, admire the walls hung with fine fabric. They don't stroll through the rooms or go out into the garden, if there even is a garden. Better not to philosophize, the unknown poet shrugged. You and I have long since survived our own ruin. For me in artifice, you in literature, and no ruin can surprise us now. The man of culture lives out his spiritual life in many different countries, not just one, in many different times, not just one, not merely his own, and he can choose any ruin he wishes. He's not sad, just bored. When death comes to him at home, he'll just bellow, "You again," and it'll seem funny. Baumkafkin became sad, very sad. He walked over to the window. What delightful tanned children those pioneers are, he thought, and smiled. For some reason, he felt a jolt of joy and freshness, as if a gust of sun-drenched air had burst into the room. There it is, the youth of the world again, he thought.
Okay, so you've already met Baumkafkin. You've probably got a sense that he has somewhat delicate sensibilities, and is also some difficulties in adjusting to what he sees as a vulgar reality around him. This is an important context for the next passage. Is he has idealized his friends as also above all of this vulgarity, and so now he is at the apartment of his friend Kostya Kisinkin. You may know him as Rotikov, but Kisinkin here, and for an evening of old-fashioned music. And so everyone moved into the neighboring room. Already seated were deaf old ladies and little old men with side whiskers and goatees, bouncing young ladies, elderly young men lisping pretentiously as in the days of their youth. The walls were hung with portraits in round golden frames. The grand piano was open, its keys and strings trembling. Aglaya Nikolaevna was bowing left and right. Flowers were brought to her, roses, white. She took a sniff, bowed, smiled. The thin hands of the little old ladies and men clapped. She hasn't changed a whit in all these years, they whispered to one another, our beloved Aglaya Nikolaevna. In 1910s, she was N's lover, whispered one elderly young man to another elderly young man. She has such a marvelous little dog, whispered one of the bouncing young ladies to another bouncing young lady. Aglaya Nikolaevna sat down. Once again, the hands were raised. Again, the keys were pressed. Again, pure music fluttered wildly like a butterfly. Two young ladies presented lilies. Ah, Aglaya Nikolaevna, said Kostya Kisinkin, today you have given us a real treat. The dining room was suffused with light. On the walls, the few remaining plates from the Imperial Porcelain Factory with their landscapes and portraits gleamed with gilt. Bottles of wine and decanters of vodka stood on the table. The little glasses sparkled. And all around was something pink, something red, something white, something pale blue. Nothing was missing. The little old men and an elderly young man had the sense that this was just a copy and everything real had died, that this was a kind of recollection, always less vivid than actuality. And they suddenly felt sorrowful, so sorrowful. Furthermore, they noted that in order to arrange this evening, certain objects from the dining room had disappeared, had been sold. Bring me my purse, Monsieur Damatova, whispered to Baumkafkin. It's in Konstantin Petrovich's room. The moon illuminated Kostya Kisinkin's room. The wind lifted up the edge of the velvet that was covering certain illustrations. And then Baumkafkin saw something that he was not meant to see. He crushed the purse in his hands, opened his mouth, and sat down. But what is that, he thought? What is that? A person with such subtle taste, and then above him, the velvet was alternately covering and again revealing dozens of naked bodies, men's and women's, in all manner of positions. He felt that something was not right in this house. Snakes, he screamed, snakes, and ran headlong out of the room. And back at the table, it seemed to him that there, leaning over, leaning back, laughing loudly, speaking, leaning in, lifting forks to their mouths with food of various colors were snakes with little green hands, and that only he and Maria Petrovna were alive. He was particularly struck by the unknown poet. He noticed that the poet was utterly white, that his eyes were greenish, and that he was no longer a young man at all.
Again, as many of you already know, the author of Goat Song makes occasional appearances as a character in the book. And at one point in the novel, actually invites his protagonists to a dinner party. And I'm going to read part of that section. I put bottles of wine out on the table. Baum-Kafkin arrived first and went to examine my books. We all love books, he said quietly. Our philological education and interests are what distinguish us from the new people. I invited my hero to be seated. An hour later, all of my heroes had gathered and we sat down to table. You know, I turned to the unknown poet, I followed you and Baum-Kafkin one night. You are always following us spiritually, he broke in and looked at me. We are in Rome, he began, undoubtedly in Rome and in intoxication. I felt this, and words tell me this at night. He lifted an Apulian riton. Am I pronouncing that correctly? It's like a goblet, riton. Okay, you don't know either, fine. To Julia Domna, he lowered his head and standing, drank. Kissenkin rose elegantly. To refined art. Kittenkin left up. To a science of literature. Triniton teared up. To la belle France. Baum-Kafkin lifted a Renaissance-era goblet. Everything went quiet. I drink to the ruin of the 15th century, he croaked, spread his fingers wide, and dropped the goblet. I gave Piranesi engravings to all my heroes. Everyone sank into mourning. Ekaterina Ivanovna alone did not understand. Why are you all so gloomy? She went around clamoring. Why are you so glum? The stove crackled, throwing sparks. My heroes and I sat around it in a semicircle on the carpet. Kissenkin stood up. Let's start a collective novella, he suggested. I got up and lit a candle. Go ahead, I said. From childhood, I have been confounded, he began, sitting down in an armchair, by kitsch. I am convinced that it has its own laws, its own style. One time I was told that a certain former secret counselor's wife was selling off the contents of her room. I hurried over. Imagine a former smoking room in a bureaucrat's house. A Turkish divan, a whole array of ashtrays shaped like shells, palms, and leaves, on tables high and low. Little poof chairs, a writing desk left intact for some unclear reason. Walls decorated with pictures of actresses from lowbrow Parisian theaters. Giving a bow, I entered. On the divan, a charming creature was singing and playing the guitar. Its resplendent bluish skirts, after the fashion of the previous century, embroidered with golden bees, its feet in blunt-nosed silk slippers. What an astonishing secret counselor's wife you are, I said, bowing. Oh no, it laughed. I am a young lad. And with a glance, it indicated that I should sit on the stool next to the divan. You're not cold? It asked, and not waiting for my answer, wrapped me in a cashmere shawl. Lowering its head, it began examining a book with talking flowers. The time of lovely Nana, la dame camélia, has passed. It broke the silence and adjusted its luxurious locks. You are trying, it said, to restore that departed, frivolous, and carefree time. The unknown poet sat down in the armchair. It was a girl, though, after all. Sunk deep in the snowy Petersburg night, it had spent its early youth on the streets. It had loved silvery buildings, fast drivers, violin players in the cafes, and English military ditties. The unknown poet smiled, got up from the armchair, and walked over to the window. Triniton sat down in the chair and continued, looking at me, it spread its fan. It had been born not far from Kiev on a modest estate. Triniton ceded his spot, and Kittenkin sat down in the chair with pomp. But in the evenings, its mother had spoken of Paris, of the Champs-Élysées and cabriolet, and at 16 it ran away to Petersburg with a ballet dancer. It loved Petersburg like a northern Paris. Baumkafkin shuddered and roused. Petersburg is the center of humanism, he interrupted the story from his seat. It's the center of Hellenism, broke in the unknown poet. Kostya Kisenkin rolled over on the carpet. So interesting, Ekaterina Ivanovna clapped her hands. What a fantastical story it's turning out to be. The philosopher, who is Bakhtin, the philosopher took up his violin, sat in the armchair, and instead of continuing the story, was thoughtful for a moment. Then he got up and began playing a woozy cafe love song, keeping time with his foot. Baumkafkin, in horror, opened his already enormous eyes wide and reached out his hands to the philosopher beseechingly. Don't, the hands seemed to say, and he suddenly ran out of the room and fell face first onto my bed. But the philosopher, not noticing what had happened, was already playing a pure, beautiful melody, and his round face with its bushy mustache was profound and sorrowful. I went over to the mirror. The candles were burning low. In the mirror, I could see my heroes sitting in a semicircle and into the next room where Baumkafkin was standing by the window, sniffling and looking at us. I lifted the blinds. A dark morning was already dawning. The factory whistles could already be heard, and I see my heroes turning pale and disappearing, one after the other.
Baumkafkin went into the building where Maria Petrovna Domatova was expecting him. The rooms had been tidied, the muslin curtains shone white. An old-fashioned icon gazed down with dark eyes. Baumkafkin trembled, entering the room of a girl. As Musia was standing, for the first time he noticed that she had downy hair, a sharp little nose, small lips. I have come to propose that you study Latin, he said. What for? Musia was surprised and started laughing. That you might acquire a better sense of the city we live in, answered Baumkafkin. I know this city already without Latin, answered Musia, but I'm glad to see you. You are so delightful. Give me your hat and stick. I sat down on the rather old sofa. Where's your friend, she asked, to start the conversation. He's very busy, answered Baumkafkin. I haven't seen him in a while. Someone said that. No, I was just asking, Musia broke in. Tell me what you've been working on instead. No, we shouldn't talk about me, answered Baumkafkin. How can I say it, he thought. How can I say the most important thing? My mother will be back from church soon, said Musia. We'll have tea with jam. But how can you say the most important thing, thought Baumkafkin, to such an innocent and radiant creature? He went pale. Excuse me, I'm in a terrible hurry, and barely saying goodbye, he left. What, did his stomach start hurting or something? Lucy was angry. She felt bored. She walked over to the cage and, lost in thought, began poking the canary with a finger. He kept flitting from one perch to the next. Rotten luck, thought Lucia. All my girlfriends have run off to the altar, but I'm left alone. It's so dull. She went over to the piano and began playing Scriabin's Ecstasy. Her mother came in. Take the books off the table, she said. What books? Lucy turned her head, continued to play. Oh, Baumkafkin must have forgotten them. She walked to the table and began flipping through the books. Vita Nuova, she read out loud. That man is occupied with worthless nonsense, remarked her mama. A sheet of paper fell out of the book. Lucy picked it up.
My God is moldering, but has preserved his youth. And above all, I dread microphone. Above all, I dread a wide bust and shoulders a woman's thigh, the sob of female skin that drank in agony, the agony of passion. And so I wonder now, like Origin, and watch the sunset freezing and immense. It's not for me, Maria, the lock of wedlock, your question rising in the trembling black air.
Kafkin returned home in terrible agitation, and only then he realized that he had forgotten the books. Oh God, he nearly screamed. Maria Petrovna has read it. He sat down in his bed and thrust his fingers into his graying hair. At that moment, the doorbell rang. It's me, called a voice. The unknown poet walked into the room. Don't despair, said the unknown poet upon leaving. Everything will work out. No one knows what girls are like. Musi read the paper and became thoughtful. She quickly drank down a cup of tea. She said that she had a headache and got into bed. How wonderful Kafkin is. This means he really is a virgin. My God, how interesting. Extraordinary man right in our city. There's so many brutes after all. How sad his life must be. I will definitely marry him. We will live like brother and sister. Our life together will be extraordinary.
The last passage that we will read today is not quite from the end of the book, but we figured since we began with the book's 2 forewords, we'll close today with one of its interwords. Actually, the idea of the tower was present in all of my heroes. It wasn't a feature specific to Kafkin. They would all have loved to shut themselves up in the Peter Hoff Tower. The unknown poet would have occupied himself with verbal fortune-telling there. Kostya Kisinkin couldn't have resisted the tower as obvious kitsch. As I write, odious time flies. My heroes live in great dissipation, scattered across the face of Petersburg. They no longer meet, no longer convene. And although spring is already here, Kafkin is not wandering enraptured around the park, not picking flowers, not awaiting his friends. His friends will not come to him. He will not rise early in the morning, will not read one book today, another tomorrow. They will not talk here in the sleeping park, which wants to bewitch them into thinking they are the representatives of high culture. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It was wonderful. But we are not over with reading. We have a few other poems by Vaginov, as far as I understand, not from the novel, in Eugene Ostashevsky's translations.
So,
I don't trust you.
so I'm going to read 5 poems that I translated for the introduction. And the first 2 poems are from 1922-21. They're very, very early. He has just returned from his stint in the army during the Civil War, where he probably worked as an orderly, but we don't really send it served. I remember the last night in the home of my deceased childhood. Books dismembered, the lamp overturned on the floor. I ran out into the streets, and the eyelashes of the bronze sun toppled with a double sound into my wound up shoulders. Monks, snows. I'm in the crowd of a pauper army, a pounce into Poland, then a bounce to the east. Oh, how it glows, the Chinese dead sun. I remember looking forward to it in the long nights of longing. Back in the homeland, I'm eating lentil stew. The hum of the Baltic, the mild gait of the winds. But there's no made-up Masha to undo the door chain for me. A pack of white humans in moonlight gnaws on a horse. 2. This is about his return from the army. Each has his mouth around a neighbor's leg. Outside, the steppe glows. The summer evening is easy. I'm riding north on a dead train to the city where the dead sun gleams like ice. My way is calm. My passions are past. I don't know. Shall mother meet me? Shake my hand. I've heard my city became a placid friar, hawks candles and bows low bows. They also say the ships are coming in now into the unpeopled city with foreign wines and silk in the hold. They ply the dead one with drink, then they dress it in silk. Hey, quicken, stoker, hurry to the north. The night is clear tonight. How like a corpse it smells. We are dead, Ivan. The clover is over us. The German colonist stirs on the threshing floor. The third poem, Music, was written in the mid-20s and is cited by Eugene, the pianist in the Bakhtin circle, in a letter to a composer where for her this is the model of art, of what she wants from her listener as the listener listens to her play. Words fly in book rotatories. I wander in word repositories. All of a sudden, like the nightingale, a word breaks into song. I run towards the stair. The word is there before me like a hallway, a journey underneath the agitated moon, from dark to light, from literal bluffs to the indefinite shifting of the sea. Music does not lie in sounds. It lies in the transformation of images. Nor O, nor A, nor any other sound mean anything around such music. You're reading a book. Far off you hear a choir of dancers circling near. Desire for laughter comes my way on an unforeseen spring day. And the last two are from his last year when, as a terminal tuberculosis patient, he was sent to a sanatorium in Crimea in December, which is not very nice. And the fourth poem, the one I'm going to read now, Mandelstam, after listening to a mutual friend recited in Voronezh. This is already after Vaginov's death. called it a real posthumous poem. Which is like a great blurb. The nor'easter bowed palms, medlars, olives, swayed the sequoia like a woman. The pelerines of stair steps stuck fast, soon onto the shoulders of cliffs. I wandered over the subterranean shore and saw a nightingale. It was engaged in mimicry. It recalled with its voice a statue awash in sunlight. I stood on the balcony of a subterranean building. Snow flurries flew. The moon was a boat. The gale cracked its glacial scourge, punishing flowers and grass. I found myself in an Elysium of crystal, where there's no grief, where there's no love, where like reflections icy and far away, the nightingales that make no sound sway. And the last one, which is my favorite. Crimea. I stepped into a reflecting pool. An orchestra played love under a hail of acorns. Spectators from all reaches of the USSR stood specter-like and took in Carmen. How beautiful love is at the time of consumption. I cannot suffer your familiar voice. You are eternal like a stone carving. Your listener is longingly or tediously somebody else. A blind beggar, he circuits the green garden and horribly gropes the petals. He longs like the prodigal son to enter that singing, amorous nightingale world.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So I think we have a few minutes if the audience has questions, comments. Yes. You don't have to answer for this.
So we thought we were being pretty original, but quite recently, what is it? Is it Saltykov-Shchedrin? There's a new translation. Yes, that actually so it's catching on. They've translated it as full. Yeah. So I mean, I think it's certainly for Russian readers of this book, the names are overwhelmingly speaking names. And as most of us in this room know, this is usually true of a lot of books written in Russian. And the convention has been not to. And with this book, it wasn't immediately an obvious decision because not all the names are as speaking as others, but most of the main characters in this book have names that the meaning of which is very closely tied to their characteristics as people. And even the way they interact with each other. And it is also a way, I felt, to convey some of the texture of a text that is absolutely poet's prose. All four of the novels very much are. And so I'm so glad that we could hear some of the poems this evening as well, because Vaginov began and ended as a poet. And of course, the texture is one of the things that is difficult to convey in translation. And so it was like, at least we can do this. But then how to translate them was, of course, a whole other headache. Thank you, of course.
How did you choose which you really wanted to work with? And I think you feel very proud of it.
So we translated from the version that was published in 1999 in Akademический проект in Petersburg that was edited by Tatiana Nikolskaya and Vladimir Erl. And so we followed their version. We reproduced many of their notes in the book, but and the way they deal with that is they have an appendix at the end that has those, like, we at one point in the draft we have them labeled outtakes. And so they actually are part of the translation. They will be in the book, but as an appendix. So we don't mess around with the different versions. We use this, what is more or less an authoritative version from 1999, but we do give the outtakes. Yeah, so you have the option of going, and there are more forewords if you want. Mhm.
I have a question in front of you, actually. So Vaginov will appear now as an Anglophone writer, so to speak, right? And so who would you compare him with? Where will you place him next to?
I'm gonna relax.
Well,
I think it's a similar question, but maybe let's put it differently. What kind of languages, idioms, examples were things that you used as your bearings when working on the problem? Because you keep hearing that this is mainly the Russian Borges, but I didn't hear the Borges in your translation. I heard a kind of a twisted, broody existentialism, maybe of the Lispector kind. And the same goes for poetry as well. This was completely transformative, because this, I think, was the first time in my life that I finally heard that dark bronze of Baudelaire in Vaginov's poetry. Did you use that as a standard, as a sort of a measuring tool by which to organize the stylistics in your translation? Was it accidental? What was your reference point?
Okay, so we have two questions.
all right, well,
Yeah, why don't you?
I'll answer the first question, which in terms of reading it, I mean, I think that the reference in English, when I was thinking about it, are actually early Yves Lenoir, Decline and Fall, and early Yves Lenoir, and to some extent, Ronald Furbank, though it's not quite as précieuse as Ronald Furbank, but there's a précieuse side about the whole thing. And maybe a little bit somebody like Raymond Roussel. I mean, a kind of like locus solus, a kind of, so, I mean, I think you see it in a kind of, you know, it's a work of the 20s. And I doubt he read any of those people. So it's kind of interesting that, and they certainly didn't read Vaginov, but that there is a kind of, so that was my sense. And now I'll put it over to who you had in your head.
No, back to me. You want to say?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say from my own perspective, didn't use any particular writer as a model, but sort of, I guess someone I was more or less by chance reading around the same time that I felt resonance with in English. It was Nathaniel West. You know, with a lot of very cutting satire, a lot of great tonal shifts in prose. You know, there are a lot of ways to draw the analogies, but I definitely felt that resonance there. I think we did, and I will just say, kind of to your other point, I think we picked the more brooding passages to read today for the most part, and that might have to do with the general mood that just felt like that it was apt. This is just what we felt was what we wanted to read. I think we do have like passages that are a lot less brooding than these, and it kind of the tone shifts a little bit, definitely among the novels, and that was something that we really tried to be deliberate about, to give each novel a really distinctive tone, which unfortunately we don't have anything before you to see if that was successful, but that was a thing that we very much had in mind. Yeah, so that's my response.
As far as the poems are concerned. Sorry, as far as the poems are concerned, so, I mean, although, you know, I was certainly aware that he started writing under the influence of Baudelaire, I was actually thinking about something else. I was thinking actually about his classicism and this, or I mean, his classicism, his post-classicism, right? So both the classical and the introduction of it was John. So, and that's very, I mean, that's very much what I was thinking of it rhythmically also. So kind of very loose classical meter, but really Ostashevsky, which is really, you know, maybe we hear it here and there, but especially with the two earlier poems. I mean, all of these poems, I even wrote them out as couplets because I was thinking something like from the Greek anthology, actually.
I have to say, the tower being built so 958.
Yeah.
Except that we were the last romantics, being traditional sanctity and loveliness and so on.
Polina, do you want to know? All right. Any other questions? Thank you. Thank you so much. Was this a question? So if there is no questions, then thank you, our dear panelists. Thank you for this book. We are looking forward to it. I thank you all for coming. Thank you.